Okay, welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger K. Green, and this is going to be a contextualized reading for Book 22 of Homer's Odyssey, Slaughter in the Hall. This is, of course, part of our ongoing course on Homer and the Critique of Western Civilization. So, this is the climactic chapter, right? If we're following the classic sort of Aristotelian rising plot that to the climax, and then the resolution or denouement, what at least children in my culture here in the United States learn in fifth or sixth grade, as early elementary school. The shape of this kind of epic storytelling is something that is ingrained within us from an early age. So the aesthetics, at least, of Western civilization surround us, pervade us where I am. And so even though I'm, of course, giving a critique of Western civilization, and because of the ways that white supremacists have invoked that terminology as something to praise so that they can code and continue on with their white supremacy, I think that that there are plenty of defenders of Western civilization, conservatives among them politically, who are not necessarily white supremacists, so there are definitely nuances. But the part of the problem of the times that we live in is that the cartoonish characters that are part of our political world amplify these mythological aspects of so when we think about myth and mythology here, of course I'm talking about myth in terms of the structuring stories that we tell ourselves, right? And Enlightenment has been one of them, right? The European Enlightenment, capital E, Enlightenment, has been a structuring myth in more recent centuries in so-called Western civilization. And of course, in my last contextualized reading, I mentioned critiques of the Enlightenment. Now, of course, these are internal critiques. They happen with Romanticism, with Hegel, thinkers like that who are very much within the sort of normal trajectory of people who are defenders of Western civilization. But then there are critics in the 20th century, such as Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, who are critical theorists, who are coming from the Marxian tradition, Marx being a student of Hegel, of course. And they are going to say that what we see, they agree, right? They would agree that what we see is some type of lineage that persists with the idea of Western civilization that goes all the way back to the Greeks. But they're going to look back to Homer and to Odysseus, and they're going to say, yeah, we can see the origins of totalitarianism as it blossoms in the 20th century, all the way back in these earlier texts. So those are the when thinking about like politics, celebrity, notions like the Enlightenment, even legal notions, I think, might operate in terms of a structuring narrative in our current society. So people who are so-called constitutional originalists are working on a certain kind of narrative and hermeneutic relationship to that particular document that has a lot to do with rhetoric and rhetorical framing and how they want to read, as if we could really live in the same way, or feel the sorts of pressure that the people who wrote the founding documents of the American Republic could be today. It's an imaginary thing. It's a reading device. It's an aesthetic conception that certain people use. And we tend in the United States not to take aesthetics seriously. famously in the past. I can't go on too far because this is a contextualized reading, but Walter Benjamin, the famous critical theorist, advanced the phrase that fascism is the aestheticization of politics, right? In the United States, there is a kind of hatred of art. I would say, I mean, it's sad to say, like, we actually produce a lot of really great art too, so I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, but in our political culture in the United States, we do not tend to fund the arts. The humanities are always on a constant attack. We are always being pushed out of schools and such. And at least in classical liberalism, there was this notion of philanthropy, that where the big capitalists would feed back into society. But now we're in this current formation of society where neoliberalism, advanced capitalism, whatever terms you want to call it, there is not a lot of giving back in terms of the idea of arts or the humanities. And so in that sense, you know, maybe I could come to some sort of agreement with some kind of conservative, right? Like I've said that certainly not all conservatives are far right conservatives who are overt white supremacists. But then if I were to go down that road, and this would take us into another lecture, then this would become a discussion about the place of the humanities in our culture. And all of those concepts will show up in future lectures after I'm done with these contextualized readings. You can see I'm kind of foreshadowing towards them right now to keep you on board so that you might return when I'm done with book 24 and a couple of contextualized reading lectures, to come back and listen to the analysis lectures. I've only done one race analysis lecture between contextualized readings 4 and 5. A long time ago now, even though it was only a month ago, not even a month ago when I made that. It's been a long haul through this epic. So we knew from the beginning, from the first contextualized reading lecture that I made, that Odysseus is going to make it home and he's going to slaughter these people. So we've had 21 books of build-up to this particular moment of slaughter in the hall. I want us to pay attention to the cinematic imagery, which I've mentioned in contextualized readings up to this point. I want you to think about the ways that this kind of imagery shows up in our popular culture all the time. I last week rewatched Rambo: First Blood, the Sylvester Stallone film. Lots of Odysseus showing up in just the masculine rage of the returned soldier who's disrespected. Rambo, this post-Vietnam story. But lots of Odysseus also showing up in the character of Don Draper from the TV series The Mad Men, right, which is a multi-season long series about ad executives on Wall Street in New York in the 1960s, throughout the 1960s. So it's telling the story of the unfolding of the 60s, that shift from conservative 50s culture to the 60s through ad agencies. It's a brilliant show. Yet Don Draper, of course, one of the central figures in that show, is a kind of Odysseus type of character, and we could look at that show as a comparison. Although maybe there's not the slaughter in the hall climax in Mad Men. So here we are. We left off book 21. Here I am delaying you even more. Just a little nod to Homer there. Slaughter in the hall. We left off book 21. Odysseus is ready. He's strung the bow. Telemachus is behind him, spear in hand. Now stripping back his rags, Odysseus, master of craft and battle, vaulted onto the great threshold, gripping his bow and quiver, bristling arrows, and pouring his flashing shafts before him, loose at his feet, and thundered out to all the suitors, "Look, your crucial test is finished, now at last. But another target's left that no one's hit before. We'll see if I can hit it. Apollo, give me glory." Remember, this is Apollo's feast day. Apollo is the god of archery. Odysseus has just strung his bow. Excuse me. He aims at Antinous. And this brilliant image, violent as it is, one must appreciate at least Homer's style here, poetic style. With that, he trained a stabbing arrow on Antinous, just lifting a gorgeous golden loving cup in his hands, just tilting the two-handled goblet back to his lips, about to drain the wine, slaughter the last thing on the suitor's mind. Who could dream that one foe in that crowd of feasters, however great his power, would bring down death on himself and black doom? But Odysseus aimed and shot Antinous square in the throat, and the point went stabbing clean through the soft neck and out, and off to the side he pitched the cup. So that long, this is so brilliant in terms of just the language and craft of Homer here. With this is all around the image of the cup, right? And the delayed gratification of the image, that accordion fanning out and fanning back in, and then coming back. Off to the side he pitched. The cup dropped from his grasp as the shaft sank home, and the man's life blood came spurting out his nostrils, thick red jets. A sudden thrust of his foot, he kicked away the table. Food showered across the floor, the bread and meat soaked in swirls of bloody filth. The suitors burst into uproar all throughout the house when they saw their leader down. Now, just that image, I just want to hold on to the graphic nature of that image, the controlled language that Homer is able to use. Violent as it is, as I said, I know it is violent, is the aesthetics of this language that we call the foundation of Western civilization reveal a reverence for the bloodiest of violence, especially when it's revenge, but especially when it is revenge. And I think there's something else to notice here. So we know that it's Apollo's feast day, that there's the archer, that the arrow goes straight through the neck, so the arrow hits the mark. But remember in the last book when Antinous was rebuking the disguised Odysseus and calling him a drunk, that he drank too much wine. We know that Apollo is also the god of wine. Not the same god as Dionysus, but Dionysus has not even shown up in the text yet, right? So Apollo is this kind of rational god of wine, of civilization, one might say. He is the counterpart to the Dionysian in Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy and the Spirit of Music, right? And so what is happening right here, I think, with the image of the cup in Antinous' hand, it's full of wine. He said, let's do libations to Apollo, and then we'll sacrifice a goat for him tomorrow. Apollo is getting back at Antinous here, and he doesn't even let him take a sip of this wine he's about to take. So he's lifting it up, the arrow goes through, the wine goes, the cup goes to the side, he kicks the table, the food goes everywhere, but also there's this almost like transfer of imagery. Instead of ingesting this red wine into his mouth and body, the arrow has gone through the neck and the blood spurts out almost like wine coming out of a faucet or like a tap shooting out of his nostrils. That controlled imagery is just delivered with an incomparable expertise. So we have to give Homer that. How much do we want to hang on to that imagery with Homer and how much we delight in it is a question that goes all the way back to Plato in Western civilization and to Book 10 of the Republic, right? Where he himself, Socrates, delights in Homer as well. And he challenges us for what is the place of art in Western civilization, and it's a conversation that's been carried on ever since, or at least in circles who deal with literature and literary criticism is dealing with, that trajectory, the long trajectory of Western civilization. We need to ask what we're holding on to, right? Those of us who are taking seriously the critique of Western civilization, what do we hold on to in terms of that? Certainly, as I've said, and I will say more and more adamantly as I go on, I don't think that we can call Homer the poet just a white man, right? Or a white male, right? There's no such thing as a white male in Homer's society. That is a later construction, a later social formation that's based on a kind of racism that develops later on. But that doesn't mean that there are no forms of racism present in this particular book, right? That there aren't class relations, for example, in the text itself that we see persist in current day society, right? So we need to be able to hold all of those different tensions in mind at once. So after that death image of Antinous, anti-being, we then, the suitors, of course, all turn on Odysseus. And here, Homer tells us, so after this kind of break, they're all yelling at him, your game is over, you've shot your last, you'll never escape your own headlong death. You killed the best in Ithaca, our fine prince. Vultures will eat your corpse. Now, one would think, with all of Xenia and everything out there, and all of the warnings that they've already had, that the guy who actually strung the bow, that it might strike them that he might be a god or he might be Odysseus himself. But none of that even registers with the suitors, right? So groping, frantic, each one persuading himself the guest had killed the man by chance. Poor fools, blind to the fact that all their necks were in the noose, their doom sealed. With a dark look, the wily fighter Odysseus shouted back. So this is like, again, like the control that the poet Homer has here. I've already invoked Aristotle's Poetics earlier. So this might be a moment, I have a little question mark by it, but it might be a moment of hamartia, right? Which is translated as missing the mark in Aristotle's Remarks on Tragedy. Now, this is an epic. It's not a tragedy, right? But so we want to be careful with trying to just apply Aristotle's Poetics just directly to the epic genre here. But I think that the idea of not just excessive pride, which is hubris, right? But the idea of missing the mark, which sometimes has a connotation of kind of blindness or moral blindness to it as well, that can kind of come out here. The guests are definitely blind, but the poet, the way that the poet says this, each one persuading himself the guest had killed the man by chance. So they seem to know, they should know, on some other level, they ought to recognize, and maybe they even do recognize what's happening here, but they're persuading themselves not to see what's in front of their faces. Brilliant sort of attention, I think, to human ability to tell ourselves a completely different story than the one that's happening in front of us. Um, so they have definitely made an error in judgment here. And the missing the mark language is obviously a counter in archery, right? It's like it's a metaphor from archery, and so it counters the directness of the language that shows up on Apollo's feast day. Odysseus then rebukes them, and he identifies himself as, of course, Odysseus. And this sets the suitors into a unification against them. But first, the sweet talker, smooth talker Eurymachus tries to get out of it. And he does so by trying to scapegoat Antinous. Now, you invoke that term scapegoat because that's part of the Apollonian festivals, right? That then is also, we see scapegoat sacrifices showing up in Judaic or Hebraic culture as well. No time to go into that here, but if I just want to mention that it's there. I think that actually, while I do say that, and I need to come back to him in a later lecture, but Renee Gerard, really important critic of mythology, and who wrote, of course, a whole book on the scapegoat sacrifice. Renee Gerard went to his death being a defender of this idea of Western civilization, and you can watch Hoover Institute interviews at Stanford, the conservative institution, with Renee Gerard, where they're taking his interpretation of mythology in that defense of Western civilization stuff. Gerard, whether you agree with him or not, at least I will say of Gerard that he is somebody that, if you're dealing with mythology as a discourse, one has to deal with his thought. He's an important thinker, even though he ends up being a conservative one who is working on right-wing think tanks. Just because we disagree with him doesn't mean we shouldn't read him or hear what he has to say. It's through that interaction and dialogue that one would want to counter him and say why he's wrong. And I have a lot of reasons why I think that Gerard is actually wrong, but that is for a different lecture. Just want to mention his name in the scapegoat here. Invoke Gerard with respect, right? Eurymachus here says, so spare your own people. This is all Antinous' fault. He's blaming it on Antinous. Spare your own people. Later we'll recoup the costs with a tax laid down upon the land, covering all we ate and drank inside your halls. And each of us here will pay full measure too. 20 oxen in value, bronze and gold, we'll give until we melt your heart. But before we've settled, who on earth could blame you for your rage? He tries. But what does Odysseus do? Odysseus refuses. So this is a point where we're in Odysseus's house. He is seeking revenge. He has already taken it out on one person, and he goes full on with his rage. Where have we seen this earlier? Well, we saw it in the last book with the comparisons to Heracles. I think that is what Homer is up to, and in seeing the rage that Heracles put onto the guy who gave Odysseus the bow that he has just used. And Odysseus, who's always been in a relationship with Zeus and Xenia, and who's met Heracles in the underworld. There's something going on behind the scenes in terms of the way of the intertextuality is working here, that Homer is trying to tell us something. Odysseus refuses. No, Eurymachus, not if you pay me all your father's wealth, all you possess now, and all that you could pour from the world's end. No, Not even then would I stay my hands from slaughter till all you suitors had paid for all your crimes. Now life or death, your choice. Fight me or flee if you hope to escape your sudden bloody doom. I doubt one man in the lot will save his skin. The fight then opens. Eurymachus calls the suitors to arms. Homer tells us, brave talk, he drew his two-edged sword, bronze, honed for the kill, and hurled himself at the king with a raw, savage cry. In the same breath that Odysseus loosed an arrow, ripping his breast aside, the nipple so hard it lodged in the man's liver. Out of his grasp the sword dropped to the ground over his table. Head over heels he tumbled, doubled up, flinging his food and his two-handled cup across the floor. He smashed the ground with his forehead, writhing in pain, both feet flailing out, and his high seat tottered. The mist of death came swirling down his eyes. So the second major suitor, Eurymachus, is killed here, but killed in gory detail. And he is also killed. Note that the difference here, and I think that the respect given to Eurymachus, if we can say that there's any given, is that he is able to go out fighting in a way that Antinous is not. So he lets out this moment of rage. Now, the right-wing conservative philosopher and also National Socialist and famous anti-Semite Martin Heidegger would see this as very much a form of authenticity or authentes, right? That in spite of fate, Eurymachus here is going to go into battle. He's going to take up his rage. He's going to take up his angst. He's going to go, and he dies immediately in the midst of that moment of pure fighting. That is the aesthetic of Western civilization and Greek culture that I think is carried on in our cinema, in our other literature, in our idea of the hero and hero worship itself. Heidegger, another philosopher, it's like important to engage with his thought. That you can't just, yes, I mean, he's a Nazi, that is established now, but he's still one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. And the critical theorists, many of them, are reacting directly to his thought. Herbert Marcuse being a student of Heidegger's, among many. So then we get Telemachus Killing, and he kills Amphinomus, who has run off, and Telemachus puts a spear through his back, and so we get the younger son, the son making his first kill. Then he says, "Dad, what should we do now?" Right? And Odysseus sends him off to fetch weapons, and he's still got the quiver and the arrows that he's letting loose on people. So we've got this kind of weird, I think, juxtaposition of actually action that goes on in the epic here. It's hard to kind of see exactly where everything is going on and how the certain enemies get into the storeroom here. I will admit that that's kind of convoluted in Homer's telling here. Maybe he's not as good with the action by action point as he is with those images and those similes and the layering and the direct language here. Odysseus, once he's let loose all of the arrows that he has, he then turns and arms himself. And there seems to be enough time for him to sort of be like, okay, and I'm going to put my quiver down and go and pick up, a spear and arm myself, put on a helmet. It's got the horsehair on it. We get a lot of description there. It's like, what the hell are the suitors all doing in the moment when Odysseus is just doing this? Are they just sort of cowering behind tables? What is happening? Then they've sent the goat herd Melanthius to go, of course, scour um, uh, um, uh, um, away and to get arms for the suitors. Um, and so uh, he goes away, and Eumaeus and the cowherd see him going away as well. They can't quite tell what's going on right now, like Odysseus and Telemachus, like what's going on with the suitors. Some of them are seeking a way out, but the passages have been blocked. And then the goat herd, then Melanthius clambers up through smoke ducts high on the wall and scurries to Odysseus's storeroom, bundled a dozen shields and as many spears and helmets, ridged with horsehair crests and loaded with ease, rushed back down to the suitors. So this kind of like happens in an instant. It's kind of crazy, to think in terms of a play-by-play type of action here. Odysseus's knees shook, of course. They are wondering where the arms are coming from. Then Telemachus says, Dad, I made a mistake. I left the door ajar. They're able to get into the chamber. So Eumaeus and the cowherd are sent to go stop him. And they say, well, what should we do when we stop him? And should we kill him or should we bring him back to you? And Odysseus says, I want you to lash his back to a plank and strap a twisted cable fast to the scoundrel's body. Hoist him up a column until he hits the rafters. Let him dangle in agony, still alive, for a good long time. So there's this element of torture. It's not just kill the guy out, like right out. There's an element of torture. There's definitely, well, it's anachronistic to say that, so it's sadistic, right? But of course, the word sadistic comes from the Marquis de Sade, who's a later historical figure. The text tells us that you mocked him. So use that second person again. You mocked him, Eumaeus, my good swineherd. Now a good guard through that whole night, Melanthius, stretched out on the soft bed fit for you, your highness. You're bound to see the morning rising up from the ocean, mounting her golden throne at just the hour you always drive in goats to feast the suitors in the hall. So it's again, I think that the idea that the goat herd Melanthius is being killed and sacrificed, but also he's been able to kind of jump up into the smoke ducts, which is kind of goat-like. If you ever watch goats like climb cliffs and things like that. So there's a lot of different layers going on here in relationship to Apollo. But again, Apollo never makes an appearance. Instead, Athena then shows up here in the text. She shows up as mentor, who's kind of like showing up to save the day. So Zeus is shown up in the form of this thunderbolt that happens, the clap that happens the moment that Odysseus pulls the string on the bow that he's strung as easy as a lute, or as easy as a lyre, I guess, is a better instrument for the time. So Odysseus cries out to Mentor, so he cried, yet knew in his bones again it was Athena, driver of armies. And then the suitors call out to Mentors. They say, don't follow Odysseus, join us or we'll kill you. And then Athena attests Odysseus here. So they've tested, they've yelled at Mentor / Athena, rousing words, but she gave no all-out turning of the tide yet. She kept on testing Odysseus and his gallant son, putting their force and fighting the heart to the proof. So usually it's Odysseus testing people and testing people, but here we have Athena testing Odysseus. And it's through the testing and through the struggle that one becomes great in the aesthetics of this text. 6-on-1 fighting Odysseus we get in the next few passages, but they take them all out, of course. Then we get these moments of people begging for mercy. The first is Laertes, who clutches Odysseus and begs for mercy. He's, of course, a seer, but he himself, as Odysseus says, only a priest, a prophet for this mob, you say? How hard you must have prayed in my own house that the heady day of my return would never dawn. My dear wife would be yours, would bear your children. For that there's no escape from grueling death. You die. So, ask for mercy in his own house. Again, this repeat of the action of no mercy. First it was Eurymachus, now it's Laertes. Then we get Phemius the bard, who begs for mercy, lyre in hand. And Phemius begs, I hug your knees, Odysseus, mercy, spare my life. What a grief it will be to you and for all the years to come if you kill the singer now, who sings for gods and men. I taught myself the craft, but a god has planted deep in my spirit all the paths of song. Songs I'm fit to sing for you as for a god. Calm your bloodlust now, don't take my head. He'd bear me out, your own dear son Telemachus. Never of my own will, never for any gain did I perform in your house, singing after the suitors had their feasts. They were too strong, too many. They forced me to come and sing. I had no choice. Telemachus then, of course, intercedes on his behalf. Odysseus grants mercy for Phemius, mercy for the bard. Remember, this is going to parallel way back earlier in the text, back in the opening books, that Telemachus had interceded on Phemius' behalf when Penelope had said stop singing, and Telemachus says don't blame the singer, don't blame the bard, even when they sing us songs that bring us to tears. They are important to us, and so bards are important. Of course, Odysseus is the storyteller himself at various different instances in the text. And then we get a cast back over the carnage in this room. Odysseus scanned his house to see if any man still skulked alive, still hoped to avoid black death. But he found them one and all in blood and dust, great hauls of them down and out like a fish that fishermen drag from the churning gray surf in looped and coiling nets, and fling ashore on sweeping hook of beach. Some noble catch heaped on the sand, twitching, lusting for fresh salt sea. But the sun god hammers down and burns their lives out. So the suitors lay in heaps, corpse covering corpse. Gory, intense image. I think about this image, and as I was, preparing the notes and thinking about the contextualized reading today, I was also thinking of these instances in news media. So the recent school shootings in Texas is the most recent one coming to mind for me. At least they got mass national attention. We know that many happen every few days, but at least this mass shooting of elementary school children. We could go back to the Columbine massacre. I'm a graduate of Columbine High School. I was not there. I was a little bit older, so I was not there that day, but I have a younger brother who was there the day of the massacre at Columbine, and he made it out okay. I'm not going to say more about that, or okay as you can be. I mean, like, really, you know. But these moments in our culture that we see in Western culture over and over again, where people lock other people into a space, the Aurora theater shooting, the classroom situations, the library at Columbine. This image seems to go back to this moment of revenge that we see in Homer's Odyssey. It's not to blame Homer for that, the recent tragedies, but I wonder about the ways that a culture mimics the aesthetics of violence, the aesthetics of revenge that's wreaked out on enclosing people into a room and exterminating many of them in a bloody mess. I think that at least I want to draw the parallel of persistence in the aesthetics of violence that show up in Western civilization. And it's something that if you're going to defend Western civilization, you must account for the violent side of things too. You can't just claim freedom, democracy, all of those sorts of things. Now, of course, I think that defenders, just like the Rambo story that I brought up in the last contextualized reading, I think that, you know, Rambo goes on bloody rage or rampage, right? That we see this over and over again. In Mel Gibson characters, for example, whether it's Lethal Weapon or he's Jesus Christ in The Passion of the Christ, right? Or whether he's, a Scottish figure, like always a kind of Christ-like figure, always somebody who's like Mad Max has sort of lost his wife and gone crazy and, gone on this rampage, right? And we are there as an audience with our heroes, egging them on in their vengeance, right? That is part of the aesthetics of heroism and violence and authenticity that are values that are in Western civilization, and we must look at them square in the face in a course like this. So we get that image of the dead fish, and then the other image down here at the bottom of page 451 of the Fagles translation. Euryclea, Telemachus tells Euryclea to go to the women to call them out now that the bloodbath has happened. And this is a particular moment of cruelty and vengeance that I want to share here. Crisp command that left the old nurse hushed. She spread the doors to the well-constructed hall, slipped out in haste, and the prince led her on. She found Odysseus in the thick of slaughtered corpses. Great image here again, bloody as it is. Splattered with bloody filth like a lion that's devoured some ox of the field and lopes home, covered with blood, his chest streaked, both jaws glistening, dripping red, a sight to strike terror. Where does the poet get this? Like, where did the poet was like where has the poet seen this kind of thing to come up with such vivid imagery, right? Dripping red, a sight to strike terror. So Odysseus looked now, splattered with gore, his thighs, his fighting hands, and she, when she saw the corpses all pooling blood, was about to lift a cry of triumph. Here was a great exploit. Look. But the soldier held her back and checked her zeal with warnings winging her home. Rejoice in your heart, old woman, peace. No cries of triumph now, it's unholy to glory over the bodies of the dead. These men the doom of the gods have brought low, and their own indecent acts. They'd no regard for any man on earth, good or bad, who chanced to come their way. And so Thanks to their reckless works, they met this shameful end. Quick, report in full on the women in my halls who were disloyal to me and who were guiltless. Now, this is funny to me because we know that a few books ago, Euryclea offered to do this, to report on the women, and Odysseus shooed her away. So it's yeah, well, I can figure it out on my own. I don't need your help for that. But now here he is asking for her help. And she says, and this is important to get the numbers of the slaves, the servants that Odysseus has here. Surely, child, his fond old nurse replied, now here's the truth. 50 women you have inside your house, women we've trained to do their duties well, to card the wool and bear the yoke of service. Some dozen in all went tramping to their shame, thumping their noses at me, at the queen herself. And so we get this shame showing up, and then the cruelty of Odysseus sort of coming back. And so he tells Telemachus, just to bring the shamed ones out, or the ones who did the shaming, or who have shamed him, and have those women help clean up the corpses of all of these butchered men. And he says, and once you've put the entire house in order, march the women out of the great hall between the roundhouse and the courtyard's strongest stockade, and hack them with your swords, slash out all their lives, blot out their minds the joys of love they relished under the suitors' bodies, rutting on the sly. No escape for them, right? So then the text tells us what actually happens, though. It's just a little bit of a difference there. Not too much here. The women are all sobbing. They are clean up the mess of the bodies. And then at last, once the entire house was put in order, they marched the women out of the great hall between the roundhouse and the courtyard's strong stockade, crammed them into a dead end, no way out from there, and stern Telemachus gave the men their orders. No clean death for the likes of them, by God, not from me. They showered abuse on my head, my mother's too, you sluts, the suitors' whores. With that, taking a cable used on the dark, proud ship, he coiled it over the roundhouse, lashed it fast to a tall column, hoisting it up so no toes could touch the ground. Then, as droves of thrushes beating their spread wings against some snare rigged in thickets, flying in for a cozy nest, but a grisly bed receives them. So the women's heads were trapped in a line, nooses yanking their necks up one by one, so all might die a pitiful, ghastly death. They kicked up heels for a little, not for long. And what's interesting there, so the death is the ultimate outcome. Odysseus said to hack them up with swords. His son hangs them all. Melanthius then, so this is a parallel back to Melanthius, who we know is strung up in the storage room. They haul him out. They lopped off his nose and ears with a ruthless knife. They tore his genitals out for the dogs to eat raw, and in manic fury hacked off hands and feet. Okay, so this kind of brutal imagery and action is going to show up throughout so many episodes of human violence and genocide that we are unfortunately still well acquainted with, even in recent years, in human memory, even in living memory today. So the kind of actions that accompany genocide are right here and present in this textbook, in this not textbook, but text from, more than half a millennium before Common Era. Then we see that Odysseus lights sulfur here to purify his house. Now we know this is toxic; it can kill you. That's where fire and brimstone comes from. The brimstone, when we hear that phrase, brimstone is sulfur, right, which produces a toxic gas. But because if you light a lot of it on fire, it might burn slowly. But there are sparks that will shoot out. It's well, a blue flame, not sparks, sorry. But the smell of the sulfur burning is the smell that accompanies after a light piece of lightning strikes. So that smell of sulfur, and sulfur gets associated with Zeus and lightning striking there. And so Odysseus is fumigating his house with toxic fumes in order to purify after he's killed all of the suitors. And then back through the royal house, the nurse went to tell the women the news and bring them in at once. They came crowding out their quarters, torch in hand, flung their arms around Odysseus, hugged him home at last, and kissed his head and shoulders, seized his hands, and he, overcome by loving longing, broke down and wept. Deep in his heart, he knew them one and all. What a nice ending to a very, very bloody book. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening. If you're listening on podcast, as always, there's Patreon that you can contribute to. We will catch up with you in the next book for book 23 in our Contextualized reading series. Have a great day, morning, night, wherever and whenever you are. Thanks.